all of these kind of dust-ups turn out not to be as big as people's kind of anxiety. And I get why people are anxious about it. I do not want to downplay, but I do want to say there is a Christian call not to fall into anxiety. And there's a Christian call to be discerning, absolutely. But don't let your anxiety distort. This is an ambiguous document, and this is maybe ambiguous in some ways that are going to be problematic, which I think is a fair position to take, to then saying, this is contradicted 2,000 years of church teaching, and this is game over, and people really are freaking out over it. Don't let your hearts be troubled, I guess is what I would say to that, because it's not as if the Holy Spirit was like, well, you guys were good for 2,000 years, and the warranty just expired, and now I'm not going to protect the church anymore. We've gotten through craziness before, and we're going to get through this craziness.
I think what you're saying is helpful to some people, but it's not helpful for a lot of people, because a lot of people agree with what you're saying. They know that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church.
Yeah.
What they would like to see you and other apologists do is admit that a lot of what comes out of Rome is either confusing or at times bad, so they don't feel insane.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said it, because I think that's the other, because you're right. It seems like the two loudest voices right now in the conversation are, this is a good document because it says we can do gay unions now, and voices saying, no one thinks that. You're crazy for thinking there are people in this first group. And it's like, well, are you guys even listening to each other? Like you've got people like Father James Martin in the New York Times publicly doing this thing that in the document, let's just step back. In the document, there's a permission to do a spontaneous blessing for a couple in a way that isn't going to confuse. And then the very next day, you have a not spontaneous blessing that is very much targeted to confuse, of two men holding hands that looks to all the world like this guy just did a gay marriage. I mean, you have to read the text. In other words, like the picture is completely misleading. And so that's not what was called for, and that's what's happening.
I guess I'm pushing you even further than this. What I'm saying to you, is there any respect in which this document can be criticized?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's pastorally a disaster. Okay. And I think it's pastorally a disaster because whoever was responsible for it, the DDF and Pope Francis and approving it, should have known the Father James Martins of the world are going to react in this way to it. And reading the document
would react to.
I saw the headlines before I read the document, and then read the documents and thought, A, the headlines are not right, but B, I see why the headlines read as they do.
Okay.
And so, the first time the media distorts it, fine. But it's getting a little old to say, you keep saying these ambiguous things that sound, like you can't just have this ambiguity that is going to be interpreted in this way, and then not immediately come out and correct it and say, no, you've completely misunderstood what I mean, because of course they're going to take it that way. So either they wanted that reaction, or they didn't care if that reaction happened, or they didn't foresee that reaction happening, and I don't even know which of those is the least alarming, because they would have to be entirely clueless about the modern world not to know, you say those things in that way in this time, people are going to think a certain thing about it. And so when people say, this document seems problematic, agreed. It seems ambiguous, agreed. I'm only arguing for the much lower bar of this doesn't invalidate any, I don't want to say this is not a problem. It is a problem. It's a problem when we downplay the Catholic distinctives. It's a problem when we downplay the radical nature of the church's sexual ethic. Jesus confronts us with the provocativeness of it. Look in Matthew's gospel. Jesus is asked about divorce and marriage, and he presents a vision of sexuality that is so profound to the people of his day, not just by 21st century moral standards, but by first century, that the disciples respond, well, such is the case with marriage, it'd be better not to get married. And then Jesus is like, let me introduce you to the teaching on celibacy. And it's shocking, it's profound. And so whether you're called to sexual monogamy or celibacy, those are hard teachings. Jesus acknowledges they're hard teaching. And when the church downplays the difficulty of that teaching, that's a false compassion. We need to acknowledge this is a hard teaching. You may struggle with it. You may fall while you're trying to live it out. And that's normal and that's expected. We're going to stay with you and help you fight this. But we cannot lower the moral bar because it's not our bar. Jesus gave us that bar.
But do you think that the church is lowering the bar?
I don't think the church is lowering the bar in a doctrinal way.
Do you think Pope Francis is lowering the bar as
Not
well?
in a doctrinal way. I think what's happening is there's two ways to talk about sin and sinful relationships and everything else. One is to acknowledge here's what's going wrong. And there's an important role for that. The other is to say, here's the good effort, here's the good that you're going for. And a pastoral approach needs to balance those two. Like, you mean well, but you're doing poorly.
Yeah. Every time I go to confession, I, as a sinner, or else I wouldn't be there, say, bless me, Father, for I have sinned.
Right. And so, as a sinner, you can absolutely get a blessing. This is not news to anyone. When you're at Mass and you can't receive communion because you're in mortal sin, what do? You go for a blessing. And so we've known that someone in mortal sin can receive a blessing. This is literally, as you say, the beginning of confession, that you ask for a blessing so that what? So you have the strength to seek repentance, to be forgiven.
All right, so here's the difference, it seems to me. It seems like the document is saying, and I'm probably wrong, but maybe this is why there's some ambiguity here. I read a section that did make it seem like the couple can be blessed.
It says it explicitly.
Right.
So we know these two things.
Yeah,
Prior to the document, we knew these two things. You can't bless a union. You can bless an individual. Now there's this third category. So two things happen with this document. The first is the DDF says, well, there's different ways we can talk about blessings. And that's true. Think about even the word benediction, which is, the word for blessing. Literally, bene, good, diction, speech. Like, it's to speak well. Malediction, like a curse, is the opposite. So you have liturgical blessings, but you also have this much broader sense in which the word blessing is used. And so people go up for, getting their marriage blessed, but they also go up just to get individually blessed. I'm going on a journey. Will you give me your blessing, Father? That sort of thing happens. So that is a little bit Wild West frontier theologically.
Right, yeah.
And by that I mean this, blessings are mentioned all throughout the Bible. We even talk about blessing God, and nowhere does it say, here's the definition of what a blessing is. We ask God to bless us. We say, blessed be God in the divine praises. Well, we're not dedicating God to God's use. We're not. Clearly, when God blesses us, that's different than when we bless God. Yep. The document talks about that, the ascending and descending nature of blessings. And so what the document does well, I want to give it credit for this, is acknowledges that this thing that we may take for granted, this idea of blessing, many of us haven't really thought deeply about what a blessing even is or what's happening with the blessing. So it's doing that. And then the second thing it's doing is saying, in the kind of limits of this final frontier, or, Wild West of blessings, there are some forms of blessing that it says a same-sex couple can receive. Now, that's where it becomes much more problematic.
And that's where it's different as the man coming up to communion who asks for a blessing.
Right.
I mean, to stretch the analogy, if I walked up
hand in hand with another man,
or another man or another mistress, or my computer that I say I watch pornography on and ask him to bless me and the computer, right. I mean, that's a bit of a stretch. But you see the point. It's like, if you're saying that a couple can be blessed, what exactly is being blessed? Is it the individuals so that they can strive for holiness, or is it this union?
Right. And
what does the document say is what I'm asking you.
Well, it says the couple, which is somewhere between an individual and a union. And so that's where the rubber hits the road. Because in blessing a couple, are you blessing their union? Are you blessing other elements of this interpersonal human relationship? You can bless a couple of people, but blessing a couple as couple. So the language of same-sex couple is where a lot of people's alarm bells go off, and quite reasonably, what are we trying to say here?
Yeah.
Because in the example you gave, a lot of people have maybe you even do get your computer blessed because you don't want to look at pornography.
Right.
Or you put a religious sticker. But if you're actively looking at pornography seeking a blessing, I think the priest would say, no, this is not appropriate. Well, likewise, if you've got two men holding hands in a romantic way and they seem to be actively engaged in a same-sex romantic relationship, as we saw on the cover of the New York Times, is that appropriate to give a blessing there in that context? And the answer seems to be profoundly and obviously, no, it's not appropriate. But now there's, if not a green light, I think at least maybe a blinking yellow light that certain priests like Father Martin kind of drive through.
Yeah. I thought that one of the best responses to this was Trent Horn on Ben Shapiro's show. Came out yesterday. I know Trent published it today, or some of it today. I haven't watched his video, but I thought he did a really good job, I thought, at walking that line between giving a really charitable read on. One of the things he said that I thought was important is you're not going to understand this unless you understand what just happened in Germany.
Yes,
Can you sum that up for us?
So Germany's been full-fledged pushing forward with trying to create a liturgical rite to bless same-sex unions, which is just, and in the process seems to be almost tempting the Vatican to try to crack down on them and try to provoke a schism. And so it's really alarming. The National Catholic Reporter had a priest who is, I think it's whoever he is, he's a reporter at the largest German language Catholic paper, openly talking about they don't want to go to send a schism. So they know what they're doing. They are playing chicken with the church, and the church doesn't want a Church of Germany like we saw with England, where it just becomes a kind of unrecoverable loss.
Yeah.
So whatever the church pastorally can do to not lose Germany, I think she's trying to say, how far can we go to meet you? So in this sense, I'm reminded of the ecumenical documents that we've seen in the last 50 years, say, from the church, where the Catholic Church will sit down with some non-Catholic group and say, what are the areas of agreement? What are the areas that we already have in common? And the documents are generally a good effort, but they're marred by an exaggerated sense of agreement. That, you say in the Catholic document with, let's say, the LDS, you might say, oh, well, we both believe in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And you kind of gloss over, but we don't actually mean the same thing by those terms.
Yeah.
And I see the pastoral impulse to seek the good, to see what's good in what you already believe, whatever you already have. But the danger is if you're not also balancing that with, but here's some distinctions we need to make, it's ambiguous and misleading. So I think Trent is absolutely right. The church is saying, how can we stop Germans from going off the rails into schism? We can't let them do this thing of having a liturgical rite. But is there something they can do when two men or two women come up and want to be blessed? Is there something we can do short of that isn't just black and white evil, that is nevertheless encouraging them on their spiritual journey that will hopefully end with them repenting and being full integrated members of the church again? That's a good question to have. And if we're not trying to say, how can we move heaven and earth to find the one lost sheep, then we're also not following Christ. Yeah. But we don't succeed in that, I would say, by watering down the truth. We have to find other ways of being both bold in the truth and presenting it in a loving way and accompanying people in difficult, messy situations.
So it sounds like what you're saying is this document was ambiguous in parts, that it may have came out at the wrong time and in the wrong way. And so you think that it can be criticized, but you also think a charitable read of it shows that, Pope Francis isn't trying to justify homosexual acts. Right. He's not saying that homosexual marriage can ever be a thing. He's simply saying that a couple can be blessed who are in a homosexual relationship. And I think the problem what a lot of Catholics have is they'll say, okay, but if I leave my wife and I find some woman and we're about to go cross country to live in wherever, if I knock on the presbytery door and I explain that and say, would you mind giving us a blessing? It seems highly inappropriate for the priest to give us a blessing. I mean, he might say, well, this is not okay. And that might indeed be what happens when the gay couple comes to the priest. It's just that it seems like if you can understand why me and the woman shacking up doesn't seem like a thing that should be blessed, or at least said in that way. It seems like the blessing the priest could give me is, here's the blessing, confession. So I'll hear both of your confessions, but I can't bless this relationship. Yeah. So am I wrong? Am I being too hard on the Pope?
No, I don't think so. So one of the lines was, a loving mother isn't going to refuse a blessing for her children. That was one of the arguments made kind of for this position. But I was reminded of those parents who let their kids drink underage at their house because they don't want them out somewhere else and driving home. And they're worried legitimately. I don't want something fatal to happen to you. I love you so much. I don't want to see you get hurt. Yeah. But the way they're responding to that is, I think, dangerous, of allowing maybe they need to take a harder line and a harder stand.
Here's a quote. I guess it's a quote from in the chat. Okay, Brian Holdsworth said, the fundamental problem here is that there is no such thing as a same-sex couple, according to a Catholic anthropology or sexual ethic. They are just two people who are using each other sexually.
Right, and so I started to kind of get to that one of the problems with this, and Larry Chapp points this out too, is what is this category of same-sex couple? Now, in one sense, you're recognizing a sort of reality.
Yeah.
In the same way that if you're talking about the days of slavery, you can talk about masters and slaves, even though you don't think anyone is ontologically a master
Or
over
a
anyone
slave.
else, right?
Yeah.
Or a slave. So we're using the colloquial language. I think there's reasons to push back against that. But there's also, a couple isn't a defined term, and that's, there are sometimes, this is, I know Eve Tushnet's kind of famous for pushing this, non-sexual, but still emotionally involved in seemingly romantic same-sex relationships. So when we say couple, what do we mean by that term? What are they wanting? What are they trying to do? Because all of that is really relevant morally to figure out what can we bless here.
Yeah.
So in the document, one of the things it talks about is blessing the kind of affection or love. I'm going off of memory here. I believe it's paragraph 31, but I may be misremembering. And all of that seems very problematic and very kind of loaded. Of like, yes, there is a way in which we can say two people caught up in a same-sex union may be willing the good of the other.
Yeah.
And we want to bless and acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But
to say that there are sinful sexual relationships is not to say there is two things: holy matrimony and haven of filth.
Right.
Or sex slavery. There are obviously gradations here, but in a day and age where structures of sin are seeking to convince our fallen passions that sodomy or pornography or adultery or fornication are good, I would like to hear the one institution on the planet that's been kind of put in charge of making things clear about this be very, very, very clear about this.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. And what's more, the number of times the document referred to these as irregular. Well, they're not just irregular. That's downplaying the severity. If you're not married to someone, that might be an irregular situation, but it could be worked out. But in this case, it's actually deeper because of the fact that they're intrinsically disordered. I'm not trying to bash on people who struggle with same-sex attraction or any of those things. Just to say, if a couple is shacking up, you can say, let's get you guys married.
Yeah.
But if a same-sex couple is shacking up,
it can't be regularized.
Right.
Regularized.
And so the pastoral approach you need to take is different than just an irregular kind of relationship. You can regularize. This can't be regularized. That's what the language of intrinsically disordered, which I know offends a lot of people, but that's what that language means, is we can't put this union, this relationship, this coupling to its proper ontological order.
We've shared some of the reasons why this may have been an imprudent thing to put out. One, that it's ambiguous. Two, how it came out, when it came out. And you could take issue with that. I'm just saying these are some issues that people offer. But I think another issue is, what is a priest to do now when a same-sex couple approach him and say, hey, Pope Francis said you can bless us? Like, what a very, very awkward situation to be in. And then how, you tell me this, how is the priest to respond in a way that you think the document suggests he should?
Yeah.
Do you know?
I don't. I can say here's the kind of vague advice that the document gives, and here's what he's told to do and not do to a certain extent. But the document makes clear that further advice is not forthcoming. So it's just like, well, you're on your own. And unfortunately, this is how a lot of this stuff happens, is the Vatican, rather than clarifying and unifying, makes these statements which may be true, but are confusing and potentially misleading, potentially open to misinterpretation, and then says, parish priest, you figure it out.
You're on your own.
And so I feel a tremendous sadness and sympathy for two groups in this. One is the parish priest on the front line who's trying to do right by God and by his people and saying, how can I love them the way Christ wants me to love them? And do the thing I've been instructed to do when the instructions are confusing, maybe vague. And the second group I have a tremendous sadness and sympathy for are the same-sex attracted people who are trying really hard to live celibately and who receive this like a slap in the face.
Yeah. It also seems to me analogous to when rumors would be circulating back in the 80s and 90s that the church is about to change the celibate priesthood.
Yeah.
And so as somebody who was discerning the priesthood, I thought, maybe if I want to get married, should I wait? And I didn't discern the priesthood that seriously, that was ever a serious consideration, but I think for a lot of men it was. And that was never coming out of the Vatican, or it wasn't intended to. Something like this could cause people who have same-sex attraction, who are in same-sex relationships, we all know what it's like to try to justify our passions. I know what it's like. Where you're like, I think the church is going to change its mind on here. Like, that seems to be the impression coming out of every news outlet, and I don't think you can just blame the news outlets.
Yeah, I think this is something that needs to be taken very seriously. People who are caught up in cycles of sexual sin, whether it's same sex, opposite sex, masturbation, whatever it is.
Yeah.
If they get any kind of nod, wink, nudge, green light, yellow light, that maybe this isn't so bad, that is such a tempting thing to want to say, okay, great.
Yep.
I'm not going to do the hard battle because, God loves me anyway. And it's like, God does love you anyway, but you still need to do the hard battle.
All right, I want to take some questions.